The year was 1942. The world was at war, and the Arctic Ocean had become one of its deadliest battlegrounds. Every convoy that braved the route from Britain to Murmansk carried not just ammunition and tanks, but hope for the survival of the Soviet front, and ultimately, for the fate of the Allied war effort. But amid the roar of guns and the threat of German U-boats, a new, silent killer emerged, the cold itself. Temperatures during those Arctic convoy missions could plummet below -40 degrees Celsius. Winds whipped across the deck at speeds strong enough to peel the skin off a man's face. Ice formed on every exposed surface, railings, guns, ropes, even eyelashes. But worse than all that, the freezing temperatures began attacking the ship's fuel systems. Diesel fuel, which powered many of the escort ships and auxiliary vessels, started to gel and solidify. Engines that had once been lifelines turned into useless, frozen masses of steel. Imagine it, ships stranded in the black, icy waters of the Barents Sea, surrounded by miles of floating ice and the constant fear of German aircraft overhead. A convoy of over 30 ships was reduced to floating targets because their engines couldn't burn the very fuel they carried. At first, the engineers thought it was mechanical failure. They tore apart fuel pumps, replaced filters, and even tried heating fuel lines with blowtorches. But the problem wasn't machinery, it was chemistry. Diesel fuel, at extreme sub-zero temperatures, turns waxy. Paraffin crystals form and block the flow to the engine. The colder it got, the worse it became. Soon, even the reserve engines froze. The crews were terrified. The Arctic was merciless. You could freeze to death in minutes if you fell overboard. Supplies were limited, communication was spotty, and time was running out. Every passing hour increased the risk of detection by German aircraft. If the ships didn't move soon, they'd be sitting ducks. In the command ship's cabin, a heated debate raged among the engineers and officers. The men were exhausted, faces pale from the cold and lack of sleep. "We can't move," one officer muttered. "The engines won't even cough." Another slammed his fist on the table. "Then we freeze here. We'll freeze, or the Germans will finish us." It was in this moment of hopelessness that a young naval engineer named Lieutenant Robert Fairchild remembered something his uncle once told him. His uncle, Thomas Fairchild, was a farmer from Saskatchewan, Canada, a man who knew winter like few others. The old farmer had spent decades battling frozen machinery and unreliable diesel fuel on his tractors during long, punishing winters. As Robert stared at the frozen gauges, his uncle's voice echoed in his memory. "If the diesel freezes, boy, mix in a touch of kerosene, a drop of whale oil, and a trick I'll tell you when you're old enough to need it." Back home, that trick was legendary in his small farming community. Thomas's fuel recipe kept his tractors running in conditions that froze everyone else's solid. It wasn't science, it was intuition, born from decades of trial, error, and stubborn persistence. Robert dug through the convoy's limited stores, desperate to replicate the mixture. He found kerosene, used for lamps, and whale oil from the ship's maintenance supplies. The last ingredient, the trick, was a small quantity of alcohol, scavenged from the ship's medical stores. Together, he mixed them in small batches with the ship's diesel, creating a pale, thinner fuel that smelled sharply of kerosene. The senior engineers laughed when he proposed using it. "You're going to fix this with a farmer's trick," one said. "We're fighting physics, not folklore." But Robert insisted. "If we sit here another day, we die," he said. Quietly, "Let's try something, anything." They poured the first batch into one of the smaller escort ships, the HMS Tern. The crew primed the lines, said a silent prayer, and turned the ignition. The starter motor groaned, once, twice, then, unbelievably, it coughed to life. A weak, uneven rumble filled the cold air, but it was sound, glorious, defiant sound. The men erupted in cheers. Mechanics scrambled to repeat the process across the convoy. Within hours, ships that had been silent for days began humming again. The modified fuel mixture burned hot and steady, preventing wax formation and keeping the engines alive. Against all odds, the convoy began moving, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. When the message reached command that the convoy was back underway, disbelief turned into admiration. "A farmer's recipe," someone muttered. "We were saved by a farmer." But the truth was more profound than that. Thomas Fairchild's forgotten blend wasn't just a lucky fluke. It had unintentionally mirrored the principles behind what we now know as anti-gelling diesel additives, compounds that lower the pour point of fuel, preventing wax crystals from forming. What the farmer had discovered through experience, science would later formalize into chemistry. That single act, the desperate application of an old farmer's wisdom, saved not only that convoy but potentially hundreds of lives. The ships reached Murmansk battered but intact. The supplies they carried fueled the Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually push the Germans back from the Eastern Front. When the convoy returned, the Admiralty took notice. Samples of the modified fuel were analyzed, and reports circulated quietly among military engineers. The official records listed the incident as fuel antifreeze experiment, Barents Convoy, March 1942, but those who were there never forgot whose idea it truly was. Thomas Fairchild never received any medals or official credit. He continued farming until the end of his days, unaware that his forgotten recipe had saved a convoy in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. But his legacy endured. Decades later, when post-war fuel research expanded, some of the earliest cold-weather diesel formulations bore a striking resemblance to that makeshift Arctic blend. Engineers confirmed that the mixture's balance of kerosene and oil acted as a natural anti-waxing agent, while the alcohol prevented moisture from freezing in the fuel lines. In a war filled with grand strategies and scientific breakthroughs, it was a simple, homespun idea, a farmer's faith in practical know-how, that kept the engines running when everything else froze solid. The Arctic Convoy crisis remains one of World War II's most chilling and inspiring tales, not only of endurance and courage but of how wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. And in that endless expanse of ice and death, the sound of engines roaring back to life wasn't just mechanical, it was human. It was the sound of survival, of ingenuity, and of one farmer's forgotten recipe defying the Arctic itself. Long before the Arctic convoys froze in their tracks, a man named Thomas Fairchild was quietly experimenting with his own form of survival on a small, wind-beaten farm in Saskatchewan, Canada. The winters there were merciless, the kind that turned metal brittle, froze oil solid, and made even the hardiest machines groan in protest. To a farmer, a frozen tractor didn't just mean inconvenience, it meant starvation. Thomas wasn't a scientist, not by education. He was a man of dirt, diesel, and intuition, the kind who understood how engines felt long before he could explain why they worked. In the 1920s and 30s, diesel technology was spreading across North America, promising more efficient machinery. But in the prairies, farmers discovered a problem no one had solved yet. When the cold hit hard, diesel turned thick as syrup. Fuel pumps seized, filters clogged, and engines refused to start. Thomas hated relying on anyone. When the local mechanic told him, "There's no fix for frozen fuel," he simply grunted, "There will be." So began his long series of fuel experiments, improvised, risky, and often explosive. He started with lamp oil, kerosene, even small amounts of alcohol. Sometimes his mixture sputtered and smoked. Other times, the tractor roared to life on mornings when his neighbors' machines lay dead in the snow. Through trial and error, and plenty of burned eyebrows, Thomas developed what he called his winter blend. It was a simple mix: diesel, kerosene, whale oil, and a dash of alcohol. Each ingredient served a purpose. The kerosene thinned the fuel, lowering its freezing point. The whale oil added lubrication to protect the injectors. The alcohol kept water in the lines from freezing solid. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. By 1936, word spread through nearby towns. Farmers began visiting Thomas, trading eggs or tools for a small tin of his winter blend. Fairchild's fuel became a quiet legend on the prairie, not an official product, just an old man's wisdom shared over fence posts. When his nephew, Robert Fairchild, left the farm to study engineering and join the Royal Navy, Thomas handed him a small notebook. "You'll learn plenty of clever things in them books," he said, "but never forget the things that just work." Inside the notebook were dozens of hand-scribbled notes, ratios, and sketches, the recipe that would one day save a fleet. Years later, Robert found himself aboard an Arctic convoy vessel, trapped in the ice-choked waters of the Barents Sea. The ships were dying, not from German attacks, but from the cold. Diesel fuel, the heart of every engine, had turned to wax. He remembered his uncle's words, the notebook tucked in his pack, and the winter blend that had kept frozen tractors alive back home. With nothing to lose, Robert recreated the mixture using what little the ships had on hand: kerosene from lamps, whale oil from maintenance stores, and medicinal alcohol. It was the same recipe Thomas had written down decades earlier, born not in a lab but in a frozen barn. When the first engine came back to life, it was more than just mechanical triumph, it was a moment of human ingenuity at its purest. A farm-born idea had crossed oceans, outwitted Arctic frost, and saved an entire convoy from certain doom. The mechanics began replicating the formula across the fleet. Soon, one by one, the engines roared again. A convoy once doomed by freezing fuel was now moving through the polar night, defying nature itself. After the mission, the story spread quietly among naval engineers. Some dismissed it as luck, others as exaggeration. But a few, the practical men who'd seen the Arctic's wrath firsthand, knew better. They understood that what Thomas Fairchild had stumbled upon was not folklore, but early fuel science, decades ahead of its time. In later years, chemists would explain why his mix worked so well. The kerosene acted as a solvent, reducing wax crystal formation. The whale oil served as a natural flow improver. The alcohol bonded with water molecules, preventing ice buildup. Thomas had, without realizing it, created one of the first anti-gelling fuel formulas in history. But he never knew that. Back on his farm, he continued to tinker with engines and machinery, oblivious to the fact that his forgotten notes had saved dozens of ships and hundreds of lives. When reporters visited him after the war, he laughed off the rumors. "My recipe. Just something I cooked up so the cows didn't freeze waiting for feed," he said. He never sought recognition, never wanted it. His philosophy was simple: if something works, you use it. Doesn't matter who gets the credit. And that's what makes Thomas Fairchild's story extraordinary. His forgotten fuel recipe didn't just rescue a convoy, it bridged the gap between humble farm wisdom and modern fuel science. It proved that knowledge doesn't always wear a lab coat. Sometimes, it wears a wool cap, smells like diesel, and learns by listening to the rhythm of an old tractor in the snow. In a war filled with generals and scientists, it was a farmer's scribbled notebook that kept the engines alive. A man who never saw the Arctic, never fought a battle, but whose quiet genius reached across the world when humanity needed it most. Thomas Fairchild's story reminds us that history isn't just written by those in uniforms or laboratories. Sometimes, it's written in the grease-stained pages of a farmer's notebook, pages that, in one frozen night in 1942, turned despair into motion and silence into survival. In the end, the farmer's forgotten formula became a symbol of something greater, that real innovation often hides in plain sight, born from necessity, refined by persistence, and proven not by theory, but by survival. And in the Arctic's endless night, when ships once frozen in despair began to move again, the engines didn't just burn fuel, they burned the legacy of one man's stubborn, practical brilliance. When the Arctic convoy finally reached Murmansk, battered and coated in ice, few aboard understood just how close they had come to death, or how a single man's forgotten farm recipe had saved them. They were alive, their engines humming against all odds, but the story didn't end in those frozen waters. In truth, that moment of desperate improvisation sparked a quiet revolution, one that would ripple far beyond the war and change the science of fuel forever. The convoy's arrival was met with disbelief. Naval Command had expected massive losses, not because of enemy attacks, but because of mechanical failure. Ships stranded in sub-zero seas rarely returned. Yet this convoy had done the impossible. Engineers who had given up hope reported that their engines came back to life after a special modification in the fuel. When asked to explain, Lieutenant Robert Fairchild simply said, "We used an old farm trick." At first, no one believed him. Admiralty officials, chemists, and logistics officers assumed there must have been some hidden mechanical fix, an unrecorded heating system, or a secret supply of higher-grade fuel. But when the truth came out, that a farmer's home-brewed diesel mixture had kept the ships running, the reaction was equal parts amazement and embarrassment. The Navy quietly began an investigation, collecting samples of the leftover fuel and comparing it to the standard wartime diesel formula. Laboratory tests revealed something extraordinary. The modified blend resisted solidification at temperatures nearly 20 degrees colder than standard diesel. The kerosene thinned the mixture just enough to maintain flow, the whale oil added lubrication to prevent engine wear, and the alcohol suppressed ice formation in the lines. It was primitive, but it worked. Engineers at the Royal Navy's Fuel Research Division began experimenting with the ratios, replacing whale oil with synthetic lubricants and alcohol with glycol-based compounds. Within months, they produced the first controlled version of a cold-weather diesel additive. The name didn't matter much at the time, but the idea was revolutionary. Meanwhile, Robert Fairchild wrote a full technical report describing how he had recreated his uncle's blend during the crisis. It was filed under the bland title, Field Fuel Modification Report, Arctic Convoy PQ-17 Recovery Procedure. But hidden in those pages was the foundation for what would become modern anti-gelling fuel technology. Still, official recognition eluded the Fairchilds. The military never released the report publicly, wartime secrecy saw to that. The story faded into classified archives, known only to a handful of engineers. To the rest of the world, the convoy's survival remained a minor miracle attributed to mechanical adjustments and field ingenuity. Back in Saskatchewan, Thomas Fairchild had no idea any of this had happened. His nephew's letters home were censored and delayed. By the time Robert finally returned to Canada after the war, his uncle was an old man tending a few cows and a rusted tractor. When Robert told him what his recipe had done, how it had saved a convoy in the Arctic, Thomas just chuckled. "Guess it worked better than I thought," he said. Never did trust that factory diesel in winter. Robert tried to convince his uncle to share the formula with fuel companies, but Thomas refused. "They'll laugh me out of the room," he said. "Let the smart folks figure it out their way. I'm happy mine worked when it needed to." But the legacy was already in motion. After the war, fuel companies around the world began tackling the same cold weather problem. Engineers studying field performance in northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia discovered the same challenges Thomas had faced. Decades earlier, diesel gelling, clogged filters, and engine failures. When they tested small mixtures of kerosene, lubricants, and alcohols, they found nearly identical results to the Fairchild blend. By the 1950s, major petroleum firms had developed commercial anti-gel additives, including compounds like ethylene glycol monomethyl ether and pour-point depressants, chemical descendants of the old farmer's mixture. These became standard components in diesel fuel worldwide, ensuring that trucks, tractors, and ships could operate in temperatures once thought impossible. Unknowingly, Thomas Fairchild had pioneered the concept of cold flow improvement, a field of fuel chemistry that would become essential in modern energy technology. His intuitive understanding of how to balance thinning agents and lubricants foreshadowed decades of scientific development. His story might have remained buried forever if not for an accident of history. In the 1970s, a retired naval engineer researching Arctic operations stumbled upon the PQ-17 fuel report while compiling declassified materials. The report mentioned a field-modified diesel fuel derived from a farmer's mixture. Curious, the engineer tracked down Robert Fairchild, who by then was a quiet mechanical consultant living in Ontario. Robert confirmed the story, and showed him his uncle's notebook. Inside were faded pencil notes. Kerosene 20%, whale oil 5%, alcohol, 1 part for each 10. Scribbles, stains, and grease marks covered the margins, but to the engineer, it was like discovering an artifact of industrial history. The story finally reached the public through a small feature in a Canadian engineering journal titled, "A Farmer's Fuel That Fought the Arctic." It didn't make global headlines, but among engineers and chemists, it became an inspiring tale, proof that innovation could come from anywhere. Even today, the principles behind Thomas's blend live on. Every winter, truckers in Alaska, oil workers in Norway, and naval vessels in polar seas rely on additives that trace their conceptual roots back to that forgotten farm recipe. But beyond chemistry and engineering, the story holds a deeper lesson, about the bridge between practical wisdom and scientific progress. Thomas Fairchild never studied thermodynamics or petroleum chemistry. What he had was experience, persistence, and the willingness to question what couldn't be done. When diesel froze, he didn't accept it as inevitable. He mixed, tested, failed, and tried again until he found what worked. In that sense, His recipe represents something timeless, the spirit of human problem-solving. The ability to adapt, improvise, and innovate when the stakes are highest. When we think of the heroes of World War II, we imagine soldiers, commanders, scientists, not farmers tinkering with fuel in the snow. But history is filled with such hidden figures, the people whose quiet genius changed the course of events without ever knowing it. Thomas Fairchild's forgotten formula reminds us that great discoveries aren't always born in laboratories or universities. Sometimes, they come from the smell of diesel in a wooden barn, the sound of a frozen engine coughing to life, and a man's refusal to let the cold win. Today, every time a diesel engine starts smoothly in the dead of winter, somewhere, buried in that hum, is a faint echo of the Arctic Convoy, of the ships that refuse to die in the ice, and of a farmer's stubborn belief that if something freezes, you find a way to make it burn again. That is the legacy of Thomas Fairchild, a man who never saw himself as a hero, yet whose forgotten recipe kept the engines of war, and later, the engines of the world, running through the coldest nights in history.